Welcome back to This Is Not Legal Advice. This is Jordyn Grimes here with a new segment teaching you how to not get sued. In this segment, my team and I are teaching you about libel. Now, if you're watching this because you're being sued for libel, please press pause and go call a lawyer. You've come to the wrong place. But if you're an internet troll who needs to learn what they should and shouldn't say, you've come to the right place. So what is libel? You probably have a pretty basic understanding of what it is. People typically believe it means when you tell a lie about someone and cause damage. Now, you're barely touching the surface here. Libel is a false statement that damages a person's reputation. It's a form of defamation. Now, you may say, "Oh, Jordyn, I thought that was slander, right?" Wrong. Libel is a false statement that is published. This could be published in a book, it could be published in a newspaper, it could even be posted on social media. So what's the difference between libel and slander? Libel is published speech, while slander is spoken speech. Libel used to be seen as any written speech that is false and ruins someone's reputation. Now it means anything that is published. So think about this. Let's just say Silly Sally. Let's say she posts on social media, Jordyn Grimes is a drug dealer. Little disclaimer, that is totally false. Totally. Anyways, that is a form of libel. Silly Sally posted it on social media. It's a false statement, and it would ruin my reputation. I could be kicked out of school, which, necessarily wouldn't be a bad thing. Joking. Maybe. Now, what about this? If Silly Sally said during an assembly at school, Jordyn Grimes is a drug dealer, and KMOV is there to broadcast the assembly, and they use that footage on TV, what would that be? Well, I could sue Silly Sally for slander, not libel, because it is spoken speech. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. I could also sue KMOV for libel. What? Yeah, I know. Mind-blowing, right? Libel has to be published speech, correct? Well, since KMOV aired the assembly on TV, aka published Silly Sally's speech, they committed libel. So now hopefully you have a pretty basic understanding of libel, but it's time to dive in a little deeper. So hold on, internet trolls, this is where you really need to listen. For someone to actually be libelous, there are a few aspects that must be met. Let's go through the same example with Silly Sally lying about me on social media. First, it has to be false. This part is pretty hard to prove. How can I prove I'm not a drug dealer? Well, I can't. The standard for proving this in court is based on a preponderance of evidence. This simply means more likely than not. The jury has to decide if they really believe I am a drug dealer based off of things mentioned in court. The published speech also can't be something crazy that no one would believe. If an unreasonable person believes that it is true, then that is still can be classified as libel. Sally said my name in the post. Her followers know she was referring to me. If Silly Sally just said someone in her school smokes weed every day, and I knew she was talking about me, that's not libel because she didn't identify me. But what if Silly Sally said a sophomore women's basketball player smokes weed every day? There are only 3 of us. Is that libel? Yep. Since there is such a limited number of us, it could be. That still counts as libel. From Silly Sally making such an outrageous statement about me, I'll probably get kicked off the basketball team. I'll probably get in trouble with the school. With libel, there are 2 ways you can ruin someone's reputation. If you accuse them of criminal behavior or you cause them to lose money. I'll probably lose my scholarship, so Silly Sally knocked those 2 out the park. The last part is a bit hard to understand, so hold on to your hats. We're almost through the hard part. I would have to prove to a jury that Silly Sally was negligent with her speech. This just means that Silly Sally didn't do the research to see if I was truly a drug dealer, or, she just blatantly lied. But if I was a public figure or a public official, I would need to prove that Silly Sally acted with actual malice. So let's say I'm Beyonce and Silly Sally made the dumb mistake to call me a drug dealer. I'd have to prove Silly Sally truly wanted to hurt my reputation. So, if you made it this far, you either understand the gist of libel, or you did something bad and you're probably about to get sued. And if that's the case, then maybe you deserve to get in trouble. Like, did you just not read the name of the podcast? This is not legal advice. Now, let's head over to Molly with some examples to help you.
So Jordyn told us a little bit about what libel means. So now let's talk about a few cases and a few examples. So one case that deals with libel is the case of the New York Times versus Sullivan. It's the most important libel case. I know we've talked about it in class already, and This case that happened in 1964 was the case that ended up in the U.S. government determining that people can't use libel laws to silence legitimate speech. And it's what made legitimate speech a element of the Constitution. Didn't put it in the Constitution, but made it something of that level of importance. And I think we should talk about it. So for this, I'm going to be looking at oye.org, which is run by Cornell's Legal Information Institute. So in this case, which took place during the 1960s, the New York Times ran an ad rallying for donations in support of Martin Luther King Jr., who at the time was being tried for perjury. But the problem was the ad had several factual inaccuracies in it, and the plaintiff, City Public Safety Commissioner L.B. Sullivan, felt like the criticisms of his subordinates were just as offensive to him as they were to them, even though he wasn't the exact target. So he wrote a request for the New York Times to retract the ad, which is what's required for a public figure under Alabama state law. And the New York Times refused to retract the ad, so Sullivan filed a libel case against them, as well as a group of African American ministers mentioned in the ad. It was a state case, they ran it past a jury, and the jury awarded Sullivan $500,000 in damages, and then the New York Times appealed the case to the Supreme Court. And a little side note here, to sustain a libel claim, the First Amendment states that the plaintiff is required to prove the defendant knew about their statement being false or quote-unquote reckless when they decided to publish it. So that's what the Constitution has to say about it. Anyway, back to the case. In the case of New York Times versus Sullivan, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in favor of the New York Times. This, of course, meant that the case was then not considered libel. And Justice Brennan, who wrote the Supreme Court's opinion statement, said that the information being false wasn't enough to call it a libel case. He said that Sullivan, the defendant, or the plaintiff, he said the plaintiff needed to prove that the New York Times and its affiliates were aware that the information they were spreading was false, which is, as we can see based on how the court ruled, they did not know the information was wrong, because there is no good reason why they would publish false information on purpose, or at least the jury determined that there's no good reason for that, and the court ruled in favor of the New York Times. And it's important because it set the stage for an entire history of libel cases after that. And now let's look at a more recent case, which is Fox News versus Smartmatic. And this one's a lot of fun. And I think this one is unique for a lot of different reasons. In this case, Smartmatic is suing Fox News for making false claims about Donald Trump. The thing that makes this case so unique, though, is that they're suing Fox for repeated statements they made about Trump, not just one specific newscast or whatever. So this was going on for a long time. And I also think it's interesting that this case involves journalism, which, usually journalists know better than to do this kind of thing. So you would think that you wouldn't see it a lot. And another side note, right now I'm reading from the National Law Review. So, quote unquote, Smartmatic is an election technology and software company that provided services to Los Angeles County, California, in connection with the 2020 presidential election, close quote. That was from the National Law Review. I don't really know what it means, which is why I couldn't paraphrase it, but it seems to me that Smartmatic had something to do with voting in LA County in 2020, and Fox News was mad about it. So what allegedly happened is apparently after the 2020 election, Fox News made several false statements where they claimed that Smartmatic, quote unquote, stole the election from Donald Trump. one example of these statements is when Fox News claimed that some swing states had used Smartmatic's technology somehow. And another example, Fox News claimed that Smartmatic was designed for fixed elections. Another example, they said that Smartmatic had already swayed elections in Venezuela and Argentina in the past. And a final example, they said that Smartmatic transferred some votes that were originally for Donald Trump over to Joe Biden. And that's just a few of the things Fox News is in trouble for saying in this case. So Smartmatic sued Fox News for defamation with the claim that actual malice was present because they had to have known that this information was false and would definitely hurt Smartmatic's reputation as a business entity. Then Fox News tried to get this case dismissed, but their motion was declined, and the court said that Smartmatic had sufficiently pleaded actual malice because they, Smartmatic, alleged that Fox News knew the information about the election results was false and recklessly chose to spread this information anyway. And with the amount of power and influence that Fox News had, that created real injury because it spread misinformation to very, very many people. And the court kind of made their decision based entirely on the fact that these claims were so outlandish, just a very extreme case of fake news. And they even said that the claims Fox News made were, quote, so inherently improbable that even if Fox chose not to air the statements, they were still disregarding truth by even coming up with them. And obviously Fox tried to defend itself after that. They said the network made no specific defamatory statements against Smartmatic in particular. However, they're still liable for defamation, so they're still in trouble. And another side note, this isn't that important, but I think it's interesting because I didn't know about it until I started studying this case. In some states, there's a thing called neutral reporting privilege, and it pretty much protects anyone who wants to make a defamatory statement as long as it's true and unbiased, but it doesn't exist in New York, and obviously Fox News is allegedly being very, very biased, so it wouldn't even apply. And basically what I'm saying is there's this thing called neutral reporting privilege, which is designed to help protect free speech, and Fox News was not able to utilize it in this case. So those are two libel cases. The New York Times versus Sullivan case that basically invented libel law as we know it today, and the Fox News versus Smartmatic case, which is an example of how this libel law plays itself out in the modern world. And that's all I've got. Now we're going to go on to Kaylin. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly and Jordyn. For this next portion of our podcast, we are going to talk to two professional journalists and see their take on libel and what they've done in situations where they've either been threatened with libel cases or sued with libel cases, and how they approach their stories in order to prevent being threatened or sued for libel cases. Our first guest that we have is Paula from ESPN, and let's see what Paula has to say. Have you ever dealt with a case of potential libel? Or?
I mean, all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, that, I'll tell you this, like I said, is very, very case specific, and I don't know if you have the ability or the resources, but what I would do if I were you is do your reporting, gather all your documents, and when you have that, if there is a First Amendment attorney or someone you can consult with, I would do that. There's two places you could reach out to. The first is the Student Press Law Center. Are you familiar with them?
Yes.
Oh my God, they're amazing. They really are. I would reach out to the Student Press Law Center, and then I would also reach out to the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Both those agencies have a legal hotline. And like I said, when you have done your reporting, because that's what they're going to ask you too, is what do you have? When you have done your reporting, I would call both of them up and pose that to them and see what they advise you to do.
Next, we have Tom, also a senior writer from ESPN. Let's see what Tom has to say about libel and his thoughts on how to prevent yourself from being sued for libel.
Have you ever experienced, or have you ever gone through a case or a story that you've written where you had to experience?
I've never been sued for libel, and I've been doing this a really long time, so I've not been sued.
Have you ever been threatened to be sued for libel?
Yeah, but people threatening and being sued are two different things.
Yeah.
A lot of people just will say, "Oh, you're gonna go out and sue you." That's mostly bullshit.
How do you think I should approach that so I don't fall into a situation?
Well, I think that you have to surround yourself with people that you trust. I think that you have to, talk to your editor first. Have somebody who is from the outside, checking the facts. Talk to a lawyer.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of it is getting people from the outside who will, because like when you're doing a story, it's really easy to just fall into the enthusiasm of it. We're fighting the good battle, and this must have happened, and you make assumptions, and you can really, get into trouble,
Yeah, that's very true.
So.
All right, I want to thank Paula and Todd for taking the time to speak with us today about their own personal experiences with libel and how to go about preventing ourselves from getting sued for libel or threatened with libel. That does it for our podcast for today. We're going to wrap it up. I want to send a shout out from Molly and Jordyn. Remember, this is not legal advice, so if you're looking for help with a libel case, you have not come to the right place. Unfortunately, I would go seek out a lawyer immediately. We cannot help you in that situation, but we've done all that we could to inform you about this topic. I hope you guys have a blessed life. We'll catch you next time.